Thank you for coming to our talk. This is Rats and Ladders, focusing on staging patterns and operator psychology. So the first question we have is why does incident response still feel like Snakes and Ladders in 2026? We all remember Snakes and Ladders. It's a childhood board game where you roll a dice, move each specific portion towards the end. I think it's the end goal, the end of the board game. There's ladders on the board, there's snakes on the boards, and IR can sort of be similar in the metaphorical reason for this board game. These ladders are ways that threat actors are leveraging these remote access Trojans and initial access into the networks to quickly gain access and sort of cheat their way towards their action on objectives. So think of ladders as credentials, overprivileged accounts, things of that nature. And then snakes are the reasoning or the reason why defenders are sort of failing in identifying these remote access Trojans. Ways they're misinterpreting alerts, they're not handling these alerts properly, and sort of bring them back to square one. Another question I like to pose. A big rat we've seen within the Blackpoint SOC is Screen Connect. So if a rogue Screen Connect instance was downloaded today, how long would it take your environment to flag it? Would it take 15 minutes? Would it take 1 hour? Would it take a day? Would it take 2 days? These are great questions to have, especially when our specific perspective is the SMB space, so small, medium businesses. It's not always going to be enterprises that can afford these giant security stacks. These are your local dentists, your local CPA firms that don't have the ability to pay for the shiny tools, know how to tune the shiny tools, and also properly handle incidents relating to the deployment of these remote access Trojans. And we can even change the narrative. What happens if the rat was downloaded from a legitimate AWS S3 bucket that's masquerading as Social Security Administration? What happens if the threat actor is abusing a free trial instance of Screen Connect? And a lot of these RMM tools, or the Shadow IT tools, leverage free trials, so threat actors can go through, set up a free trial, start spamming these RMMs throughout, getting users to download them, users install them, and then after getting that initial free trial on box, they then start spamming different rats. So think of your traditional open source rat, such as async rat, things of that nature. And it's also good detection engineering of or a good purpose to think of why is they doing this? So if you're looking for network traffic, it's coming from AWS. A lot of organizations are allow listing AWS traffic due to the nature of most of the internet relies on AWS. Same with Screen Connect instances as well. The funny thing about Screen Connect is that $H variable will always have either a hard-coded domain or a hard-coded IP. If it's a Screen Connect cloud instance, we can see it always will be some sort of relay.screenconnectcloud or screenconnect.com. But if it is a threat actor hosting an on-prem service from a VPS or things of that nature, you'll have custom domains. So a good detection engineering aspect is focusing on hey, some suspicious TLDs such as .xyz, .click, things of that nature, where they're burning cheap domains to deploy these secure, these rogue RMMs on box for their action towards objectives.
The thing we've also observed with Screen Connect is this is kind of the setup when they have a trial through the base version. You can also install and set up your own Screen Connect server, and you would see the call out going to whether it have a DNS tied to it or an IP address, and then you can run to check and see where that's actually calling out. Yes, etc. So it's not always going to be cloud going out to Screen Connect, right? They can also locally host it and expose it.
The modern day rat infestations, a lot of the focus on remote access Trojans or rat for specific is becoming very granular, focusing on what family is this. So hey, we see this kill chain happening, we see this specific piece of malware dropped on box, but we're going to write detections specific to this piece of malware and not the TTPs themselves. And this sort of leaves a big detection gap as well, because at the end of the day, a lot of threat actors are burning and churning these different TTPs to deploy different forms of malware, whether it be rats, information stealers, things of that nature. Net support is a great legitimate remote access tool that threat actors are frequently abusing for a Trojan. The aspect of how it's being deployed, at the end of the day, it's always going to be net support. They can masquerade it. They can change the name of the binary. They can deploy it via fake CAPTCHA. They can deploy it in XYZ. They may just drop it on disk themselves. But again, at the end of the day, they're still dropping net support, but the way they're getting net support on disk will always be changing.
Yeah, and I think for focusing on the why is really important because essentially, typically you need to get initial access, you need to do defense evasion to bypass EDR, you also need persistence and command and control. But these tools are kind of all of that built into one, right? They install themselves on the system, they have a certificate. Some people use them legitimately, so it's hard for an EDR to know, versus Cobalt Strike and something like this. Cobalt Strike, it knows is malware if it's able to identify it. Whereas with this, it's a legitimate tool that may be being used by a managed provider and IT professional. So it really comes down to who is using it and what are they using it for and what are the goals. It's kind of like knowing the environment and what's typical and what should be there. And there's a lot of alternatives and there's a lot of free trials for these because no one wants to use like an RMM at first without actually testing it, trying it out. And it's kind of annoying if you have to put in your credit card or validate your identity and KYC, et cetera, right? Stuff. The threat actors know that and they'll spin up like a domain and then register it as business tools, command and control, Asian.
A lot of times there is that the modern assumption gap of, hey, when there is a will, there's a way. You may be focusing on these open source pieces of remote access Trojans, but a great example is Classroom Spy. This is legitimate classroom student monitoring software. And we had an instance where a threat actor breached an RDS server and then started spreading on all workstations who have command and control. So even if you're not looking for classroom monitoring software, it can be abused when you start looking into how it operates, how it works. It's the same aspect as a Trojan. It's just labeled as a classroom monitoring piece of software. A common failure mode is detection without denial. A lot of times, organizations are relying too heavily on, hey, my EDR blocked it. I have the full security stack. I'm protected from these type of remote access Trojans. And in that case, that sort of mindset it's great, but at the end of the day, if EDR is not tuned, if you don't have proper proactive measures in place, it may be blocking the JavaScript loader. However, that JavaScript loader executed, PowerShell called out, PowerShell pulled down a .NET assembly binary and reflectively loaded it into. So the new perspective in this is focusing the brick by brick, step by step, focusing on how these TTPs for deploying the same rats or different rats or sealers over time are staying the same, how threat actors are sort of leveraging different different living off the land techniques to get these pieces of malware on disk. So defining the board from foothold to impact without the fairy tale, we're going back to the metaphorical rats and ladders game board. Each portion or each piece of the tile is a step within the initial kill chain from staging to command and control, privilege escalation, things of that nature. We have the ladders as well that are quickly getting them access to higher leverage accounts or privileged accounts, getting them towards their action objectives. And then we do have those snakes, as we mentioned before, which is leading towards the failures in the SOC in the detection engineering side.
So click to control chains, right? How does this get there? How does the initial access happen? There's a few different things. One is just the RMM installer. Someone calls in on the phone line and says they're from the help desk and they need to adjust the machine. Maybe they know that they browsed to the site and that site displayed an error, and then they can call in to actually the person that they saw navigating to it because they already have done recon and know the public IP of that company and the VPN appliance that's for that company, and then they go in and they get in by installing it. But one of the things on here that's mentioned is click once and run dialog. Pretty different things, but one of the advantages of click once is that even if they're not a local admin, so when they call that standard user who doesn't have local admin permissions, click once will let different tools run in that non-admin context, and they've reduced logging because of that, and they run out of app data. So the program doesn't need to install. It'll just run through click once, and they don't need admin permissions for Screen Connect or other remote access. Next one's run dialog. We've seen the run dialog a lot with, you're probably tracking, but fake CAPTCHA is something where they put up, when you browse to a website, let's say you're expecting to get to some resource that you're expecting, it showcases open up your run dialog and execute a command that it copies to your clipboard for you to prove that you're not a robot. It's kind of hiding with like typical internet traffic, especially with there's now more proxies and VPNs run into these prompts more often. So users are kind of conditioned to follow the steps to show they're not a robot. And a standard user who doesn't know what the run dialog is might follow those steps, and we very frequently follow those steps, execute on the machine, and that's what actually LOLBin, et cetera, to run PowerShell, actually pull that software onto the system, and they gain access. And even though they're just a local admin, we'll talk about it later, from there, especially in kind of like flatter networks, advanced to admin and domain admin. So LOLBin sideload pivots. Essentially, one thing with sideloading is they'll take a legitimate application that's signed. They'll find a DLL in DLL order that it runs, and replace it with their malicious. You need to find essentially a DLL that's not really useful to the operation of the app itself, place it and it runs with that application. Next thing is cloud-hosted intermediaries. These are essentially, how do you get that payload to the system, right? Because something has to reach out to it and pull it from the internet, that compromised machine. One option is they can host their own domain and put files up on that server that it's pointing to. But what we've seen them do a lot recently is utilize just CDNs and free file hosting, even compromising legitimate sites and putting their payloads on. The thing they used to do was like, they'd put their payload in YouTube, right? So the DNS callout's going to YouTube. If YouTube's not going to pull the text back from the description, run that as code, kind of like C2. But there's all different kinds of CDNs. One example is Discord. If you upload a file there and you delete the chat, it still stays in the CDN. So they can upload their payload, delete it. Until it gets reported, it's going to remain on the CDN.
Last one, RMMs as persistence. So when we were talking about Screen Connect earlier, abusing those free trials, again, they're 14-day free trials. They will expire. So their access to that cloud hosting for the RMM tool will expire and they'll lose access to it. So a lot of times they're using these free trials and then pushing out your other RMMs, other traditional rats. And we've seen 6, 7 Screen Connect instances with like async rat and other remote access Trojans pushed on the same machine within a short period of time. So this is a cool case study. What's yours is mine. Sort of highlighting the methodology threat actors are taking. The first screenshot is from Screen Connect cloud-hosted Screen Connect instance, the logs from it. We can see the Screen Connect account administrator running a curl command out to a metalink.click to pull down this WES1_E.exe. This was a MSP cloud-hosted Screen Connect instance. This was ran on all their customer environments, which was over 50 plus. If you think the average organization has 10 to 15 workstations in an SMB, you can say 500 to 1,000 devices, all getting this binary on disk. The metalink.click was a sort of open source file hosting platform that I think this was a VPS in the Netherlands. And what this binary did was it's an installer for a Screen Connect wrapper. So the methodology is, hey, we're breaching a cloud-hosted Screen Connect instance. The on-prem devices will have Screen Connect installed. So we're going to drop a wrapper to leverage dependencies from Screen Connect to run our own version of Screen Connect without actually being the install process created a malicious service that was called reference worker. We can see it setting a name like Microsoft.NET Assembly Reference System Service. But again, that methodology and mindset is they're eventually going to reset the credentials for that cloud-hosted Screen Connect. They're going to lose access from that. So why not live off the already present dependencies on the machine by the legitimate RMM to build their own platform to call out to command control. And the C2 was some sort of random VPS in Italy. And again, this wasn't just a one MSP aspect. This was multiple MSPs that got breached, all calling after the same VPS. So this threat actor was looking long-term, hey, how can I maintain persistent access into these SMB networks without dropping other files on disk and living off the land of what's already present? So again, the latter is the technical shortcuts that turn one host into oh no, ways to sort of increase access in the network, speed up the threat actors towards their action on objectives.
So credential ladders, right? Kind of what we were talking about earlier. Once they get onto that system, even if they're just local admin, browsers have a plethora of credentials that get stored in memory. And there's an SQLite database that is also there, depending on which browser you're using, that threat actors can just feed into. The next one we see is, we have Green Eggs and SAM here. So there's SAM and security hives. And then if you also take system, you can actually get credentials out of those. And then there's also LSAS, right? So when typically from kind of an attack perspective, you think of like relay attacks, ADCS templates, Kerber roasting, et cetera. But a lot of this is kind of already there on the systems locally in terms of like Active Directory accounts and such that you can gain access. So what we see very typically is when they come in, they don't run these kind of redirector attacks and ADCS templates. That's more when they pop like the VPN and such. If they've already got access in the network, they're able to find credentials in big files. A lot of people just name it passwords.txt, passwords.select. And then a lot of standard users also have access to shares and map drives that have, again, config files, passwords, service account password. Or maybe that user doesn't have proper permissions set up, and for some reason has RDP access to the domain control. We have seen it, unfortunately. But yeah, and especially too with a lot of the networks being flat, once you gain access and access on one system, it's pretty trivial in your average environment move and gain access to other machines. Control Manager, WMI. We see also them use, again, kind of LOLBas, right? There's a lot of binaries that you can use to remotely execute that will just use WMIC. You can use that to process call, create, execute on another, as long as you have credentials, right? So kind of testing that out. Again, going back to the browsers, a lot of service accounts and even user accounts, the passwords are very weak. Passwords are used with their personal accounts or similar to their personal accounts. And then also, a lot of those service accounts are shared passwords. So pop one of the users, or I guess you only need to pop one of the users that has access to that, right? So typically it's pretty trivial once you get on a system, kind of escalate privileges on local admin.
And the screenshot showcases this was a Node.js based rat on the host. Once the threat actor had command and control via the rat, you can see them calling PowerShell to push it's the CSV name's blurred for PII reasons, but it's the hostname.csv. We can see it's a cred scan results. So essentially the threat actor ran a find string and sort of custom script in PowerShell to locate all files that had keywords such as API, login, password, things of that nature, and then push it to their own platform, just then using that rat to look for those credentials as well. So again, it's the methodology of, hey, they're on the host, they're looking for ways to quickly move throughout the environment, looking for credentials, looking for overprivileged access. And another good aspect is try Cloudflare is a free version of Cloudflare. I forget exactly the requirements to register an account, but we see threat actors using like automated systems, automated platforms to try and churn and burn through these try Cloudflare accounts just to host their command and control behind a free version of Cloudflare.
So again, back to privilege ladders, right? You get local admin. Most of the time with local admin, you have SE impersonate privilege, name pipes, or several other things to get to system. There's also abuse to where, let's say you only have shell access, you don't have GUI access to it. With a scheduled task, and there's several other ways to do this, you can also bypass UAC because it would be kind of annoying for standard users. Every time a scheduled task runs at an admin level, a pop-up appears, right? UAC is essentially sign in. It'll say yes or no, and that's determining if you run it as an admin. Hit no, it runs through click once. You hit yes, that's UAC, and you allow it to run as an admin, right? Now with scheduled tasks, if you create a scheduled task, you'll just bypass UAC. So if you have command line access and you need to install something without prompting the user yes, no, you can also use scheduled tasks for that. We've also seen scheduled task abuse to where they will remotely schedule tasks on other systems to run. Another thing we see is the domain-wide privileges. So if you get access to the main controller, obviously you can modify the group policy. We've seen threat actors modify the group policy to essentially push out and attempt to gain access to red line, etc. But they can just put it in sysvol and then it'll run on every machine once.
And a lot of times in these SMBs, they're not always security focused. Sometimes the domain controller is the RDS server. A regular user, say Stacy in accounting, is wanting to connect to her machine. She actually connects to the domain controller before RDPing to her workstation. So again, RDP is already publicly exposed on the domain controller. That can then get brute force, and as Jason was saying, they can create group policy to start pushing out payloads.
And real quick, LOL drivers. We've seen kind of an increase in drivers being used to like disable EDR, right? They essentially find a service. They use that service and a vulnerability in a driver, use the driver to disable EDR. So that's one thing that we've seen a lot. A beep service.
So Snake, some of the classic missteps that send defenders back to square one. A lot of it is misreading attacker incentives. So we have an analyst will get a security alert. They'll say, hey, this hash is bad, or this activity is bad, and they go ahead and block the hash and say, but in reality, that hash was for run DLL32 or some other legitimate Windows dependency, and they start breaking systems. The focus on EDR stopping everything. So EDR is a great proactive solution. It does its job. However, a lot of times it will quarantine a little bit too late. The screenshot on the right is sort of showing the execution after EDR said, hey, this JavaScript file is bad. User clicked it. It spawned PowerShell via con host for a living off the land technique. It spawned PowerShell without a GUI. And we can see all the car code being called to, I think this was SVG smuggling, to call payload down via a SVG smuggled malicious code. Focusing on, it was like an insert wrap problem. So focusing too heavily on the remote access Trojans themselves and not looking at sort of the operator's objectives, and understanding the why they're doing this. Why are they running this specific TTP? Why are they doing this within their fake captcha campaign? A recent one we observed in Blackpoint in our SOC was threat actors leveraging, I think it was sync_app_v was the LOLBas. So leveraging sync_app_publishing.vbs to proxy execute PowerShell. An interesting thing about that is app_v is typically only installed on enterprise versions of Windows. So that mindset is, hey, they're focusing computers that are joined to domains instead of like your typical workgroup SMB to try and get, hey, if this does execute racket on disk, we have a more opportunistic target than just a smaller business.
And this one's a good example of like how they do some of the staging in the proxy execution, right? So you'll see that this detection was around con host evasion. Essentially what they're doing is they're using con host to run PowerShell in headless mode. So what that can do is it can mess up the process tree, where if you're looking for like Explorer running PowerShell or things like that, this now adds con host in the middle of it. They're looking very heavily at these types of things of what's on every Windows system, what can I use to execute without having to bring more into this environment that might get detected.
Last point, it's isolated, we are contained. Again, it's missing the contextual viewpoints in an incident. So, hey, Mimikatz ran on a server at 2 a.m. We isolated the server, but we didn't see the user count running it. And then that user starts running rampant 6 hours later, starting pushing out ransom payloads. So focusing on the bigger picture and asking those questions of who, what, when, where, why, how. Why is this happening? How is it happening? Why is this user doing this? To sort of paint the bigger narrative going on within a breach. So keying your network, this is a quick case study revolving around how quickly everything we've been talking, sort of showcasing initial access via a remote access Trojan towards end goal of the threat actor. It all starts with basically keys are everywhere.
And so the image is AI generated. I was curious what AI's perspective would be of like Bloodhound. But it kind of showcases like a lot of networks are flat, and there is just kind of like there's multiple paths, right? But there's one path to easily get to domain admin in a lot of scenarios, especially when you've got these types of things. So local admin on all your standard users is probably not the best. However, even if a standard user gets compromised, it's not ideal. But when they're a local admin, they have more areas and more options. It just simplifies the process. Next up is misconfigured service accounts. This is a big one. Service accounts typically have domain privileges to be able to run on multiple systems. They can pop a service account. Most of the time it's domain admin. They have a straight path to get to the domain control, backup servers, file servers, etc. Cache credentials, another big one. Find them on the there, and when you have access to delegated rights, shared permissions. Again, all of these things, it comes down to principle of least access, making sure your ADCS templates are updated, configured properly. Service accounts only have access to one.
And the specific incident we're going to be talking about is a laterdectus infection. It's a little bit older from the campaign. However, I can't speak English. Laterdectus is a malware as a service. It's typically a loader or backdoor. Threat actors were dropping it via fake captchas. I think laterdectus is Latin for some aspect of the Black Widow family. I forget off the top of mind. But in this case, we can see the malware after the user fell for the fake captcha. It pulled down this NVIDIA notification.exe. If you check VT, if you're a regular analyst, you can see, hey, it's signed by NVIDIA. A lot of times that will throw off analysis for triage because analysts will say, hey, this is signed by a legitimate company. It's not bad. They're looking for they're always looking for sort of the telltale signs and low-hanging fruit, not thinking bigger picture of, hey, what is this application doing? This application actually had a DLL sideload. It was like a randomly generated DLL. Threat actor ran the application during the kill chain. It loaded the DLL, and that established command and control. After establishing C2, they then dropped 0.exe and 111.exe in the public folder, and then worked on getting the keys to the kingdom. This is a screenshot of some of the commands they ran after establishing command and control. We can see off the bat they're pinging the first DC, the second DC. They're checking, hey, what user am I running as? Who's in the domain admin group? Who's the local administrators? We can see the jarbled PowerShell on the bottom is them brute forcing, looking for local admin access on all devices in the network, to sort of using ADSI to sort of pinpoint, hey, is there any local admin network or local admin reuse network that I can use? We can also see them fingerprinting all the machines via find string and then using that 0.exe dump system, and they also did dump SAM. Well, the system and SAM had a domain admin credential stored. This all occurred within 15 to 20 minutes, and the threat actor also was executing wmy-exec and looking at the logged on users on DC2.
Yeah, typically we'll see, especially with wmy-exec, that means that they're at kind of the command line level. But maybe the reason that they're queue usering is to see, are there admins on the DCs right now? Because they might want GUI access to RDP over. So essentially what they're doing here is they're remotely executing from the machine they've compromised on both the DCs. So they already have a domain admin account, or at least an account with local admin on those DCs. And they're querying all users, checking to see if they're logged on, how long their session's been, etc. Checking to see who's there before.
It sort of highlights that whole rats and ladders aspect of, hey, they got their initial step one with initial access. They DLL siloed, established command and control. They privest by dumping SAM and system. They got domain admin credentials, and they were executing. So some of the practical takeaways for engineering in the SOC, the big mindset shift of like, hey, especially with these shadow IT tools, a big heavy emphasis on application control. So restricting access to unauthorized applications. If your organization doesn't use Screen Connect, don't allow Screen Connect. Don't use XYZ RMM tool, just block them at that level to prevent threat actors from abusing them and starting to execute payloads in your network. Removing unnecessary vectors. So a big one is if you can cut off PowerShell, cut off JavaScript or open JavaScript and Notepad via GPO, restricting the run dialog box via group policy object. Another one they've been using the power user menu, so Windows plus X, I think, to then open CMD and PowerShell. If you're able to just block all these by GPO, you can prevent a lot of the modern day threat landscape. A lot of times, especially with the remote access Trojan deployments, they're leveraging PowerShell, they're leveraging JavaScript, they're leveraging run dialog, as well as power users. So playing chess instead of checkers, focusing on, hey, how are these threat actors thinking? What are they trying to do to get users to execute malicious commands on disk to prevent the whole kill chain from happening from the get-go?
Because threat actors love these living off the land binaries like WScript, CScript, etc. Because they know it's on every Windows system, and it can be hard to remove those from environments just because more legacy applications might rely on like PowerShell, WScript, etc. MSHTA, not so much. That's probably one to talk, but it depends on the environments too, right? These are ideals, but you have to look at the environment, test it out, see kind of what relies on it, and if you can find areas where you don't need these things like PowerShell, WScript, VBScript, etc. to run, then probably best just to cut them out and block the environment.
Yeah, another big one is focusing on the contextual. So again, asking why they're doing this. Then finally, bringing pain to the adversary. A lot of it is sharing is caring. So if you find a new TTP, documenting, writing blogs, sharing research, for example, the SyncAppV publishing, the mindset of, hey, this is only targeting Windows 11 Enterprise is very interesting because it's threat actors choosing a specific target. Sharing that sort of research helps people build the detections they need to sort of prevent the executions from ever occurring. The common trend you've seen is LLMs generated images. The initial rat image was generated by AI, and then the Bloodhound one was generated by AI. That was for a purpose. It wasn't just us trying to cheat the code, the system. A lot of times LLMs are friends, especially in the deeper space. So again, they can turn artifacts into answers. They're great at increasing analytical efficiency. So accelerate pattern matching, feeding it logs, building tools to parse out logs, whether they're SSL VPN logs or logs of any shape or form. But it is a modern day arms race as the barrier to entry for malicious activity has been lowered. And this can sort of be seen in both screenshots. I think this is in Portuguese. It's from a WhatsApp worm that we saw within the SOC. Basically, a threat actor used an LLM to build a worm that hijacks WhatsApp sessions for users in Brazil. They leveraged these hijacked WhatsApp sessions and I think a different Chromium browser to start spamming out all their contacts with zip files. These zip files had VBS. The VBS deployed a stealer at the end of the day. But again, the TTP of this WhatsApp worm, it could deploy a stealer, it could deploy a rat, it could deploy a need. And that was Rats and Ladders.
Awesome. Opening up to questions. Anyone have any questions that they have for us? Awesome.
think that means we covered everything well.
Thank y'all.
Well, if you have any, feel free to come up to us after. Also, happy to talk. Thank you, everyone.